Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza emphasized that any agreement to be adopted with Guyana on the disputed Essequibo territory must be based on the 1966 Geneva Agreement. The UN Security Council has demanded an immediate ceasefire in conflicts in Syria, Yemen, Libya, South Sudan and the Congo in order to tackle COVID-19. The African continent has surpassed the 400,000 mark in terms of COVID-19 cases and registered 10,000 fatalities. From the headquarters of Teleso English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South, and I'm Katrina Goss. We begin in Venezuela, where Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza emphasized this Wednesday that any agreement to be adopted with Guyana on the disputed Essequibo territory must be based on a 1966 Geneva Agreement and satisfy both nations. Arreaza recalled that Article 33 of the United Nations Charter clearly establishes the means to settle and find common ground regarding Venezuela's claim over the territory. He explained that the aforementioned article also indicates the means to peaceful solution, conciliation, negotiation, investigation and judicial settlement of disputes. The Foreign Minister stressed that the authorities of Guyana have decided to ignore the Geneva Agreement, which is the only accord recognized by the Venezuelan government, and expressed his confidence in international organizations and international law. The Brazilian Health Ministry reported almost 38,000 new coronavirus cases and over 1,000 deaths on Tuesday. Brazil has now reported over 1.4 million cases and the death toll stands at over 59,000. The state of Sao Paulo, the country's most populous, has been the hardest hit by the virus, followed by Rio de Janeiro. Meanwhile, it was also noted that more than 790,000 patients across the country have recovered from the virus. Brazil continues to report the second highest number of cases and the second highest death toll in the world after the United States. Former Bolivian President Evo Morales announced on Tuesday that the imminent electoral defeat of the de facto regime is leading the current government to undertake legal processes against the movement towards Socialism Party. Morales highlighted that the de facto regime of Janine Áñez initiated a lawsuit against mass presidential candidate Luis Arce in a bid to push him out of the race. Likewise, journalist Ernesto Reyes wrote an article in which he exposes the absence of constitutional guarantees for supporters of the ousted former president. Reyes also pointed to the use of the lawfare method against popular leaders in reference to the criminal complaint filed on Tuesday before the public ministry against Luis Arce for alleged economic damage to the state regarding the mismanagement of workers' social contributions. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador will fly to Washington for a meeting with US President Donald Trump from July 8th to 9th. The president's visit to the United States will be the first since he took office in December 2018.
Yesterday, we received confirmation of an invitation for an official working visit to the United States on July 8th and 9th. The free trade agreement in a new phase is also an important development, especially in the economic and commercial fields.
As their stay came to an end, Andorran authorities recognized the work of the Cuban Medical Brigade in the small European nation over the last 3 months. The team of Cuban professionals are now heading back to Cuba from Andorra, where they arrived in late March when the country was already badly hit by the COVID-19 virus. As part of the farewell ceremony, the Minister of Health praised the contribution of the Cuban Medical Brigade to lowering the infection and mortality rates in the country.
It has been a luxury to have the Cuban Medical Brigade in Andorra. We must note that our country has been seriously affected by the COVID pandemic. We have a rate of infection of 1,100 people per 100,000 inhabitants, which is similar to the rates of the most affected cities in Europe. I am not talking about countries, but rather about cities, and even so, and all thanks to what I believe are 3 aspects. 1, that people follow the guidelines of the health authority and stayed at home. 2, that the health system and certain strength. 3, the reinforcement of the health system with the arrival of the Cuban Medical Brigade. It has been seen that we have recovered control over the pandemic very fast and have successfully and significantly lowered the mortality rate. We also have offered the same opportunities to all our citizens.
Starting this Wednesday, the Latin American multimedia platform Telesur's television channel in Spanish will be available to watch 24 hours a day across Cuba. Broadcasting for 24 hours through the Cuban digital TV signal, Telesur will also see 15 uninterrupted hours of broadcasting through the analog TV signal. Telesur's expansion in Cuba guarantees efforts to continue strengthening the unity of Latin America and the Caribbean and show the political and social reality worldwide as an alternative media outlet to the mainstream. Dominican airports and hotels reopened this Wednesday after borders were closed for more than 100 days. Tourism activity contributed 26% of the hard currency income of the Dominican Republic last year and is key to its economy. The Las Americas International Airport in Santo Domingo is gradually beginning to welcome travellers, but will operate at barely a third of its normal passenger traffic. Of the 45 to 50 daily flights that it regularly received before the COVID-19 pandemic, this July 1st will see the arrival of 14 flights from New York, Boston, Miami, Orlando, San Juan and Madrid. Hundreds of farmers and fishers across St Kitts and Nevis continue to benefit from a government stimulus package introduced in response to the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. As part of the comprehensive $120 million stimulus package, the St Kitts and Nevis government has invested $10 million to boost production in the agriculture sector and ensure greater food security for the country. Prime Minister Timothy Harris revealed that to date his administration has spent $4.9 million on the fishery, crop and livestock sectors, which are set to play a major role in the continued development of the Caribbean nation. And we're taking a very short break now, so don't go away. Welcome back to From the South. The UN Security Council demanded an immediate cessation of hostilities in key conflicts, including Syria, Yemen, Libya, South Sudan and the Congo on Wednesday, in order to tackle COVID-19 in its first resolution on the novel coronavirus pandemic.
This resolution is setting clear priorities: a cessation of hostilities, a humanitarian pause, and solidarity to face the COVID-19 pandemic. There is no alternative to fight effectively the pandemic.
The adoption of this resolution is also of high symbolic importance in the sense that it proves that should there be political will, Council members are able to go beyond their divergent views, prioritize the interests of international community and deliver a message of unity. In this regard, it should be considered as a renewed faith in diplomacy and multilateralism.
The International Labour Organization has warned that the global employment crisis sparked by the COVID-19 pandemic is deepening. According to the ILO, the COVID-19 crisis has taken a much heavier toll on jobs than previously feared, and the situation in the Americas is particularly alarming. A study estimates that by the end of the first semester of 2020, global working hours were down 14% compared to last December, which is equivalent to some 400 million full-time jobs. That's more than double the number predicted by the organization back in April.
It's a gradual trajectory in the upwards direction. It is a continuing process. But I think the key thing is the geographic spread. We've seen this pandemic go across the world from its origins in Asia and Pacific and now hitting particularly hard the Americas, where we see the loss of jobs as being the worst in the world. The average across the world is now 14% reduction in work done. In the Americas, that's at 18.3%. And in South America in particular, the highest in the world, we're nearly at 20%. But the bad news is the most pessimistic scenario, which would include a second wave of the pandemic. That would mean that at the end of this year, from the current loss of 400 million jobs, we would still be at 340 million. And the Americas would still be the worst off. At the other end of the scale, the optimistic scenario, would point to quite a rapid recovery. The loss of jobs will be down to something like only 34 million, still a very, very hard hit on the global economy. We've seen that the G20, which played such a vital role in avoiding the worst happening during the financial crisis in 2008-2009, it frankly hasn't been able to play the same role up to this point. So I remain hopeful that because of the obvious and stark need for greater international cooperation, the world in some way will recover its appetite for multilateral cooperation. You know, if there is one crisis that requires a global response, it is this global pandemic.
The United States could see 100,000 new coronavirus cases a day if citizens do not start following public health recommendations, authorities have warned. According to the top US infectious disease expert Anthony Fauci, the rate of COVID-19 cases in the United States could more than double if current outbreaks are not contained. The US is currently recording about 40,000 new cases a day. The director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases declined to predict a figure for the expected death toll related to the pandemic, but stressed it would be disturbing. Fauci also warned of second waves of COVID-19 in several states, while the total number of cases has now surpassed 2.75 million and the death toll tops 130,000.
We can't just focus on those areas that are having the surge. It puts the entire country at risk. We are now having 40,000+ new cases a day. I would not be surprised if we go up to 100,000 a day if this does not turn around, and so I am very concerned.
The Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in the US city of Seattle, which was established 3 weeks ago by activists in the midst of the widespread protests against police brutality and systemic racism, was cleared by police forces this Wednesday. A large group of police in riot gear began forcing the occupiers out of the zone at 5 a.m. local time. No violence was reported, but at least 13 people were arrested in the downtown Seattle area, according to the local police chief. Video showed police on foot and bicycles and carrying batons, setting up a perimeter around the zone, while others dismantled protesters' tents and street barriers. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez and Portuguese President Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa conducted a symbolic ceremony to reopen their land border on Wednesday. The act was also attended by Spanish King Felipe VI.
The closure of the borders has been a unique moment that we hope does not happen again. We must celebrate this well. This is the oldest border in Europe, and it is a border that we reopen symbolically by visiting two fortresses that we have built through the centuries to defend ourselves and to stay separated. There's nothing better than returning today to these landmarks of separation to symbolize our common will to meet and reopen the borders with Your Majesty the King and the President of the Republic. In what concerns the European Union agreement, all the criteria in which the European Union has based its decision have been strictly epidemiological, nothing to do with the diplomacy. Strictly epidemiological, and from these criteria and reciprocity, we have been able to reopen the third countries.
Russian President Vladimir Putin held a video conference with his Iranian and Turkish counterparts, Hassan Rouhani and Recep Tayyip Erdogan, on Wednesday in order to discuss the situation in Syria.
A project of joint declaration is prepared for our meeting that presents an agreed approach of our three countries to further step on Syrian direction. In particular, we need to cooperate in order to finally liquidate terrorist groups, to promote political process led by the Syrians themselves with the UN coordinating role. The Russian side supports this document that shows the determination of Russia, Iran and Turkey as guarantors of the Astana process to pursue a consistent joint work to achieve a really strong peace and stability in Syria.
The Communist Party of China is celebrating 99 years of existence with almost 92 million members from all walks of life. In this new anniversary, the party shows an increase of 2.34 million new members, while it has raised its grassroots organisations to 4.68 million. A report prepared for the day emphasised the sustained growth within the ranks of this political force since its creation, as well as the integration of youth, workers, farmers, professionals, women and ethnic group representatives. Since its 19th Congress, the CCP amended its statutes to include new concepts of governance, thought and strategies that seek to make it a stronger organisation and move towards the desired socio-economic and political revitalisation of the country. And we have more stories coming up after this final short break, so stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. Ugandan authorities have granted access to thousands of refugees and asylum seekers in the district of Sombo as people fled from escalating violence in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. The Ugandan Parliament agreed to open 2 border crossing points in order to deliver humanitarian aid amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Ugandan health authorities, in partnership with the United Nations Refugee Agency, have conducted COVID-19 tests while delivering food and shelter to those fleeing the conflict. Meanwhile, the UN agency stated that asylum seekers will be moved to refugee centres after they have completed a 14-day quarantine period.
We are not tired. We don't have much land. Our country is small, but we still allow them out of sympathy. I wish the international community also become sympathetic and help these people. These are not our problems. These are the world's problems, international problems.
You are putting, of course, accommodation, screening for COVID. As you know, it is a very special emergency. It's the first time people are crossing in the middle of the COVID situation. You need to play smart to put all in place. Screening for security, screening for COVID and Ebola. As you know, there are also some cases of Ebola in DRC. The team are doing our best to be ready.
The African continent has surpassed the 400,000 mark in terms of COVID-19 cases and registered 10,000 fatalities. According to Johns Hopkins University, South Africa remains the most affected country, with over 150,000 cases identified from over 1.6 million tests conducted, followed by Egypt, Nigeria, Ghana and Algeria. The highest COVID-19 death toll on the continent has been reported in Egypt, with nearly 3,000 fatalities. Africa's figures continue to be very low compared to other continents like Europe and the Americas, which alone account for over 50% of cases. A group of protesters gathered on Wednesday outside the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg to protest against Africa's first COVID-19 vaccine trial. The protesters burned face masks and carried banners against the trials. The trial that began last week in Johannesburg is part of one already underway in the United Kingdom of a vaccine developed at the University of Oxford. Some 2,000 volunteers in South Africa are expected to take part. But the small band of demonstrators who gathered Wednesday at the university where the trial is based reflect long-running fears among some in Africa over the testing of drugs on people who don't understand the risks. Palestinians took to the streets of Gaza City to protest against Israel's plans to annex parts of the occupied West Bank. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had set July 1st as the date from which the Israeli regime would begin the annexation of occupied Palestinian territory as part of US President Donald Trump's Middle East peace plan. Several thousand protesters brandished Palestinian flags and placards condemning Trump at a rally in Gaza City, while demonstrations also took place in the West Bank cities of Ramallah and Jericho. Hamas, which rules in the Gaza Strip, has stated that Israeli annexation of the West Bank would be a declaration of war. Egypt reopened the famous Giza pyramids in Cairo and the Egyptian Museum on Wednesday for the first time in more than 3 months. The Giza pyramids received visitors who underwent temperature checks before starting their tour. According to Ashraf Mohialdin, the director of the Giza complex, the period of closure was used to carry out restoration and maintenance at the historic site. The Egyptian government wants to revive the tourism sector, which had showed signs of recovery before the pandemic after years of instability. Egypt's economy depends heavily on tourism, which accounts for some 12% of gross domestic product. And we've come to the end of this news brief, but you can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. You can also join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. For Telesur English, I'm Katrina Goss, and thank you for watching.
¿qué tal? Sean todos